Elias Carter had spent the better part of 15 years pushing a mop across the polished marble floors of the Viridian Conservatory of Music. Every morning before sunrise, he'd arrive in his faded blue uniform, keys jingling on his belt, thermos of weak coffee in hand, and begin his quiet rounds. He knew every creak in the floorboards, every drafty window in the east wing, and the exact time each practice room would echo with the first hesitant notes of a student warming up. But more than that, Elias knew music. Not from diplomas or recitals, but from listening. He'd never been a student here. Not officially, anyway. He hadn't grown up in a home with piano lessons or summer camps at elite music academies. His childhood had been modest, raised by his grandmother in a small apartment above a laundromat, where the constant hum of dryers formed the background score to his early years. But she'd owned an old upright piano, its keys yellowed with age, one pedal permanently stuck. It had been a gift from a neighbor who was moving out and didn't want to haul it away. To most, it was junk. To Elias, it was a doorway. He'd taught himself to play by ear, pressing down keys late at night when the laundromat finally fell silent. He'd mimic melodies from the radio, from church hymns, from the occasional street performer who passed by their block. Over time, those random notes turned into phrases, then into songs. His own songs stitched together from feelings he couldn't quite name. Joy, loneliness, hope, heartache, they all found a home in his fingers. Now, at 42, Elias still played, not on a grand piano under chandeliers, but on that same battered upright in his tiny basement apartment. After his shift ended at the conservatory, usually around 9 in the evening, he'd walk the 6 blocks home, heat up a can of soup, and sit down at the piano for an hour or two. Sometimes longer. It wasn't about fame or applause. It was about breathing, about saying things he never could with words. The conservatory itself was a world away from his reality. Students here wore designer sweaters and talked about tonal color and interpretive nuance like they were ordering coffee. Faculty members strode through the halls with an air of quiet authority, their names printed in programs alongside symphonies and international tours. Elias kept his head down, smiled politely when greeted, and never lingered near the recital hall unless his job required it. Still, he listened. Always. He'd stand outside room 204 while a first-year nervously practiced Beethoven's Pathétique, counting their mistakes not to judge, but to understand how they corrected them. He'd pause by the grand staircase when someone played Debussy's Clair de Lune, letting the notes wash over him like cool water. Music lived in these walls, and even if he wasn't allowed to sit at the center of it, he absorbed it like sunlight. Then one Tuesday morning in early October, everything changed. A bright red flyer appeared on the staff bulletin board near the custodial closet. Elias almost missed it, tucked between a notice about flu shots and a reminder to report broken light fixtures. But the bold letters caught his eye. Open audition, Viridian Scholarship for Exceptional Musical Talent. Below it in smaller print, open to all, no prior enrollment required. One winner will receive full tuition, mentorship, and performance opportunities. His heart did something strange, like it skipped, then doubled its pace. He read it again, and again, open to all. That included him. Technically, he stood there for a full minute, mop handle in one hand, the damp rag in the other, staring at those words as if they might vanish. Around him, the conservatory buzzed with its usual rhythm. Students rushing to class, a violinist tuning her instrument in the hallway, the distant clang of a door closing. But Elias felt like he was underwater, everything muffled except the pounding in his chest. Later that night, back in his apartment, he sat at his piano and tried to play. But his fingers wouldn't obey. They trembled. He thought about the gleaming Steinway in the main recital hall, the one he'd polished 100 times, careful not to leave a single fingerprint on its glossy black surface. He'd never touched its keys except with a soft cloth. What would it feel like to press them for real? To let his music live in that space even for 5 minutes? The idea terrified him. Not because he doubted his ability, he knew what he could do, but because of what might happen if he failed. Or worse, if he succeeded and still wasn't accepted. The conservatory wasn't just a school. It was a fortress of tradition, of gatekeepers who measured worth in degrees and pedigrees. He was a janitor. Who would take him seriously? But then he remembered his grandmother's voice, soft but firm. If you got something true inside you, son, don't let fear keep it locked up. The world needs to hear it, even if it's not ready. So 2 days later, he walked into the administration office during his lunch break. The receptionist, a woman he'd seen but never spoken to beyond good morning, looked up in mild surprise. "Can I help you?" she asked, pen poised. "I'd like to sign up for the audition," Elias said, keeping his voice steady. She blinked. "The music scholarship audition?" "Yes, ma'am." She glanced at his uniform, then back at her screen. "It's open to the public, technically," she said slowly, "but it's usually for advanced students or professionals." "I understand," Elias replied. "But the flyer says open to all." She hesitated, then shrugged. "All right, name?" "Elias Carter," she typed it in. "Audition date is next Friday at 3 p.m. in the Grand Recital Hall. You'll have 10 minutes. Please prepare one original piece or a classical work of your choice." "Thank you," he said, and walked out before she could ask more questions. The week that followed was the longest of his life. He practiced more than ever, not to perfect technique. His technique was rough, unrefined, but to find the heart of what he wanted to say. He decided to play his own composition, a piece he'd been working on for years, shaped by sleepless nights and quiet joys. He called it The Weight of Quiet Things. It began softly, like footsteps in an empty hallway, then built into something fierce and tender, a storm of emotion held in check by discipline. He didn't tell anyone at work. He kept his routine the same, mopping floors, emptying trash bins, wiping down piano lids. But inside he was rehearsing every moment, the walk to the stage, the feel of the bench, the first note. He imagined the stairs, the whispers. He braced himself. Friday arrived gray and drizzly. Elias took extra care with his appearance. He washed his uniform until it was as clean as it could be, pressed it with an old iron, and polished his work boots until they shone. He didn't own a suit, and he wouldn't pretend to be something he wasn't. He'd go as himself. At 2:45 p.m., he stood outside the Grand Recital Hall, heart hammering. Through the double doors, he could hear the murmur of voices. The occasional scale played for warm-up. He took a deep breath and pushed the door open. The room was vast. High ceilings, red velvet seats, a sea of expectant faces. At the front sat the audition panel, 3 faculty members, and in the center, Maestro Laurent Dubois, the conservatory's director. Tall, silver-haired, with a reputation for brutal honesty and icy composure, Dubois rarely attended open auditions. His presence alone signaled this was serious. Elias walked down the aisle, his boots clicking softly against the hardwood. A few students turned to look, then more. Murmurs started, low at first, then louder. "Is that the janitor? What's he doing here? Did he get lost?" He kept his eyes forward, focused on the piano, but he felt every stare, every smirk. Someone snorted. Another whispered, "This should be good." He reached the stage, climbed the 3 steps, and stood beside the Steinway. For a moment he just looked at it, this instrument he'd admired from a distance for so long. Then he turned to the panel. "Good afternoon," he said quietly. "My name is Elias Carter. I'll be playing an original piece." Dubois barely glanced up from his notes. He gave a curt nod. "Proceed," Elias sat. The bench was harder than he expected. He adjusted it slightly, hands resting in his lap. The room was so quiet now that he could hear his own pulse in his ears. He closed his eyes and then he played. But that moment, the first note would come in part 2. For now, all anyone saw was a man in a custodian's uniform, sitting at the most expensive piano in the building, about to do something no one believed he could. The students exchanged amused glances. One pulled out their phone, probably to record a blooper. Dubois tapped his pen against his notepad, already mentally moving on to the next candidate. No one expected what was coming. But Elias wasn't playing for them. Not really. He was playing for the boy in the laundromat apartment. For the nights he'd practiced with socks on his hands to muffle the sound. For every time he'd walked past this very hall and wondered what it would feel like to belong. His fingers hovered over the keys, and then they fell. The first note was soft, so soft it almost vanished into the air before anyone could hear it. Elias's right pinky brushed the key like a feather landing on water. A few people in the front row leaned forward, confused. Was that it? Had he made a mistake? But then came the second note, a little deeper, a little warmer, then a third. They weren't flashy. They didn't race up the scale or crash down with drama. They just existed, like breath, like memory. A student in the third row who'd been smirking seconds before stopped scrolling on his phone. His thumb hovered over the screen. Something in those notes tugged at him. Not because they were complex, but because they felt honest. Like someone had opened a window in a room that had been sealed shut for years. Elias kept his eyes closed. He didn't need to see the piano. He knew every inch of it now, not this one, not yet, but the feeling was the same. The weight of the keys, the resistance, the way sound bloomed when you pressed just right. His fingers moved slowly at first, weaving a simple melody that seemed to ask a question. Do you remember what it's like to hope quietly? The room, which had been buzzing with judgment, began to still. Not all at once, but like ripples calming after a stone is dropped. The whispering stopped. The crossed arms uncrossed. Even the faculty members on the panel who'd been shuffling papers or checking watches looked up. Dubois didn't move. He kept his pen in hand, but his tapping had stopped. His eyes, sharp and usually dismissive, narrowed slightly, not in anger, but in something closer to curiosity. He'd heard thousands of auditions, prodigies with perfect posture, conservatory-trained fingers, interpretations polished to a mirror shine. But this was different. There was no showmanship, no attempt to impress, just a man playing something that sounded like it had been pulled straight from his ribs. Then, about 30 seconds in, the music changed. Elias's left hand joined in, low and steady, like a heartbeat beneath the melody. The piece began to unfold, not with speed but with depth. The notes grew richer, more layered. A minor chord slipped in, then resolved into something bittersweet. It wasn't classical. It wasn't jazz. It wasn't anything they'd heard before. It was just a girl near the aisle, a first-year pianist who'd practiced 8 hours a day since she was 6, felt a strange tightness in her chest. She'd always thought music was about precision, about hitting the right notes at the right time with the right dynamics. But this man wasn't doing any of that perfectly. His timing wavered slightly. His phrasing was uneven, and yet it moved her more than any flawless performance she'd ever heard, because it wasn't about perfection. It was about truth. From the back of the hall, another custodian, someone Elias had worked alongside for years, stood in the doorway, broom in hand. He'd come to see what the fuss was about. Now he just stood there, jaw slightly open, eyes glistening. He'd never heard Elias play, not once. In all their coffee breaks, all their quiet chats in the supply closet, Elias had never mentioned he could do this. And now, here he was, filling this grand room with something so raw it felt like a secret being whispered in public. The melody climbed higher. Elias's fingers moved with more confidence now, not because he was showing off, but because he was finally saying what he'd carried for so long. The piece, The Weight of Quiet Things, was about all the moments no one sees, the early mornings, the lonely nights, the small acts of dignity when no one's watching. It was about mopping floors while dreaming of concert halls, about loving something so deeply you'd never asked for credit, just the chance to be near it. A ripple went through the audience, not of laughter this time, but of awe. Someone sniffled, another shifted in their seat as if the music had rearranged the air around them. Dubois finally set his pen down. He leaned forward, elbows on the table, fingers steepled. His usual expression, cool, detached, slightly bored, had melted away. In its place was something rare, genuine attention. He wasn't judging anymore. He was listening, really listening, and then came the turn. About halfway through, the music shifted again. The gentle melody gave way to something fiercer. Elias's hands moved faster now, not with showy runs, but with urgency. Chords crashed like waves against a shore. His right hand hammered a repeating phrase while his left hand surged underneath, building tension, pressure, like a storm gathering in the distance. It wasn't angry. It was determined, resilient, like someone who'd been told no 1,000 times but kept going anyway. A professor of composition, known for his dry critiques and love of a tonal theory, sat up straight. He'd heard original pieces before, clever, intellectual, full of technique. But this had soul. It had history. You could hear the years in it. The waiting. The watching. The loving from afar. Students who had rolled their eyes minutes ago now sat frozen, eyes wide. One boy mouthed, "No way," under his breath. Another wiped her cheek quickly, pretending it was just an itch. Elias didn't notice any of it. He was gone now, deep inside the music where only he and the piano existed. His shoulders relaxed. His breathing synced with the rhythm. The calluses on his fingers, earned from years of scrubbing floors and hauling trash bins, pressed into the keys with a tenderness that surprised even him. And then, just as the storm reached its peak, he pulled back. The volume dropped suddenly. The thunder softened into rain. The chords thinned out until only a single line remained, a fragile high melody, like a voice singing in the dark, hoping someone might hear. The silence in the hall was total. Not the polite silence of an audience waiting to clap, but the heavy, breathless silence of people holding their breath so they wouldn't miss a single note. Dubois didn't blink. His pen lay forgotten. His notepad was blank. Elias played on, weaving the final threads of his story. The piece wasn't long, just under 8 minutes, but it felt like a lifetime. Every note carried weight. Every pause spoke louder than sound. When he reached the end, he didn't rush. He let the last chord ring out, pure and clear, then slowly lifted his hands from the keys. He opened his eyes. The room was still. No one moved. No one clapped. No one even shifted in their seat. For 10 full seconds, there was nothing but the echo of that final note hanging in the air, and the quiet hum of the building's old heating system. Elias stood up slowly. His legs felt unsteady, like he'd just woken from a dream. He gave a small, awkward nod toward the panel, more out of habit than expectation, and turned to walk off the stage. That's when it happened. Single pair of hands began to clap. It was the custodian from the back, the one with the broom. He clapped slowly, deliberately, his eyes locked on Elias. Then another person joined in. Then another. Within seconds, the entire hall erupted. Students jumped to their feet. Faculty members stood, some with tears in their eyes. The applause wasn't polite. It was thunderous. It was grateful. It was stunned, but Elias didn't stop to soak it in. He walked down the steps past the front row and headed for the side door that led to the staff hallway. He needed air. He needed to breathe. Behind him, the applause grew louder. Someone shouted, "Encore!" Another called out, "Play again!" But Elias kept walking. He pushed through the heavy door and into the cool, quiet corridor. The sound of clapping faded instantly, replaced by the familiar hum of fluorescent lights and the distant drip of a leaky faucet in the men's restroom. He leaned against the wall, closed his eyes, and let out a long, shaky breath. He'd done it, he'd played, and for the first time in his life, someone had really heard him. Back in the recital hall, the chaos was just beginning to settle. Dubois finally stood. He didn't clap, he never did, but his face was unreadable in a new way, not cold, not stern, just changed. "He's a janitor?" he asked quietly, turning to the woman beside him. "Yes," she replied, still staring at the empty stage. "He's been here 15 years. Dubois was silent for a long moment. Then he said almost to himself, and that wasn't just playing, that was testimony. He turned and walked briskly down the aisle, ignoring the murmurs of students trying to process what they'd just witnessed. He pushed through the same side door Elias had used, his polished shoes clicking against the linoleum. He found him near the custodial closet, standing by the water fountain, splashing cold water on his face. "Wait," Dubois called out, his voice softer than anyone at the conservatory had ever heard it. Elias turned, water dripping from his chin. He looked tired, vulnerable, real. Dubois stopped a few feet away. He didn't offer a handshake, didn't smile. But his eyes held something new, respect. "That piece," he said. "Where did it come from?" Elias wiped his face with the back of his hand. "From here," he said, tapping his chest lightly. "And from every night I couldn't afford lessons but played anyway. From every time I walked past this hall and wondered if music like mine had a place in a room like that." Dubois nodded slowly. He didn't say, "You're talented," or "You should have been here years ago." He didn't make promises. But he did something rare for a man like him. He listened. "And the title?" he asked. "The Weight of Quiet Things," Elias said. "Because most of what matters happens when no one's watching." Dubois was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "I've heard thousands of auditions. Most try to impress you. You just told the truth." Elias gave a small, tired smile. "Truth's the only thing I've got." Dubois looked at him, really looked at him for the first time. not as staff, not as background noise, but as a musician, as a man who'd carried a gift in silence for decades and finally let it speak. "You'll be hearing from us," Dubois said finally. Elias nodded. "I'll be here." And with that, he picked up his mop bucket from where it sat by the closet, gave a quiet, "Good day, sir," and walked down the hall, back to his shift. Behind him, Dubois stood alone in the empty corridor, the echo of those piano notes still ringing in his mind. For the first time in years, he felt something he hadn't expected: humility. And in the recital hall, students were already pulling out their phones, not to mock, but to share. "You won't believe what just happened," one texted. "The janitor played, and it changed everything." But Elias didn't know that. Yet. He was back to work, scrubbing a spill in room 204, the same room where students practiced their scales. Only now, when the piano notes floated out into the hallway, they didn't just sound like music, they sounded like possibility. The days after the audition moved strangely, like time had stretched and folded in on itself. At first, nothing seemed to change. Elias still arrived before dawn, still pushed his cart down the same hall, still emptied the same trash bins, but everything felt different. The air had shifted. People looked at him differently, not with pity or indifference, but with something closer to wonder. Students who used to breeze past without a word now paused to say good morning. Some even asked how he was doing and actually waited for an answer. A few lingered near the practice rooms when he cleaned, not to spy, but just to be near him, as if his presence carried some quiet magic they couldn't explain. One afternoon, a young cellist left a thermos of hot tea on the windowsill with a note that read, "For the hands that speak without words." Elias found it during his rounds, smiled softly, and drank it slowly, savoring not just the warmth, but the kindness. Still, he said little. He didn't brag, didn't replay the audition in his head like a trophy. He just kept working, kept listening, kept living in the same small apartment with the same old piano. But now, when he played at night, it felt less like a secret and more like a conversation, one the world had finally started to hear. Then, 3 days after the audition, an official letter arrived. It was sealed with the conservatory's crest, thick paper, crisp edges. Elias opened it at his kitchen table, hands slightly trembling. Inside, in formal script, was an invitation. "You have been selected as a finalist for the Viridian Scholarship. Please attend the final review session this Friday at 4 p.m. in the director's office." He read it 3 times, then folded it carefully and placed it in the drawer where he kept his grandmother's old rosary and his social security card. He didn't tell anyone. Not yet. But word had already spread far beyond the conservatory. A student had recorded part of the audition on their phone, just the last 2 minutes when the music swelled into its most powerful moment. They'd posted it online with the caption, "The janitor played today. I'll never forget it." Within hours, it had thousands of views. By the next morning, it was everywhere. News outlets picked it up. Local radio stations played the audio clip. Headlines read, "Unseen talent stuns music elite," and when the mop set down, the music began. Elias didn't own a smartphone, so he didn't see any of it. But people told him. The barista at the coffee shop near his bus stop recognized him and refused to take his money. "My daughter watched your video 10 times, she said, eyes bright. "She's learning piano now because of you." A man on the bus tapped his shoulder and said, "You gave us hope, brother." Elias just nodded, thanked them quietly, and kept to himself. He wasn't comfortable with attention. Fame felt like a costume that didn't fit, but he also knew this wasn't really about him. It was about the idea that someone invisible could create something beautiful. That dignity didn't depend on a title or a degree. That music didn't care who you were, only what you carried inside. Friday came. Elias wore the same clean uniform, but this time he added a button-down shirt underneath, the collar crisp, the sleeves rolled neatly. He walked into the conservatory not through the staff entrance, but through the main doors like any other visitor. Heads turned. Whispers followed. But no one laughed this time. He was shown to the director's office, a room lined with bookshelves, framed concert posters, and a grand piano in the corner that looked more like art than an instrument. Dubois stood by the window, hands clasped behind his back. He turned when Elias entered. "You came," he said, not as a question, but as an acknowledgement. I did, Elias replied. Dubois gestured to a chair. Sit. Elias sat but didn't relax. He kept his hands on his knees, palms flat. For a long moment, neither spoke. Outside, rain began to fall, soft taps against the glass. Finally, Dubois said, I've listened to your piece every night since the audition. Not because I had to. Because I wanted to. Elias looked up, surprised. It's not technically perfect, Dubois continued. Your left hand rushes in the third section. Your pedal work is instinctive, not trained. But none of that matters. What matters is that it's honest. And honesty is rarer than talent. He walked to his desk and picked up a folder. The scholarship committee met this morning. Unanimous decision. Elias's breath caught. You've been awarded the Viridian Scholarship, Dubois said. Full tuition, private mentorship, access to all facilities, and a debut recital at the end of the semester. Elias didn't cry, didn't jump up. He just sat very still as if the news needed time to settle into his bones. Why? He finally asked. Dubois raised an eyebrow. Why what? Why me? There are students here who've trained their whole lives, who read music like it's their native language. I can't even name half the chords I play. Dubois smiled faintly, a rare thing. Because music isn't just about reading notes. It's about saying something only you can say, and you said it. Loud and clear. He paused, then added, but there's a condition. Elias tensed. You'll enroll as a full student, but I'd like you to keep your custodial position, part-time. Not because you need to, but because I think this place needs to remember that greatness doesn't always wear a tuxedo. Elias blinked. You want me to keep cleaning? I want you to keep being you, Dubois said. The conservatory has become too polished, too perfect. We've forgotten that music was born in kitchens, in fields, in basements, places where people work with their hands. You remind us of that. Elias looked down at his own hands, rough, scarred, stained with years of soap and bleach. Hands that mopped floors and played piano with equal devotion. I'll do it, he said quietly. Dubois extended his hand. This time it wasn't just a gesture. It was an offering, a bridge. Elias shook it. That evening, as he walked home through the rain, he didn't feel like a janitor or a student or a viral sensation. He just felt like himself, finally seen, not for what he wore or what he did, but for what he carried in his heart. The next week, everything changed officially. Elias was given a student ID, assigned a practice room, room 101, the best one, with the newest Steinway. Enrolled in theory, composition, and ear training classes. At first, he felt out of place. The other students were decades younger, fluent in musical terms he'd never learned. They spoke of Schenkerian analysis and harmonic substitutions like it was casual conversation. He sat quietly, taking notes in a worn notebook, asking questions only when absolutely necessary. But something unexpected happened. Instead of mocking him, the students began to seek him out. A composition major asked if he'd listen to her new piece. I want to know if it feels true, she said. A jazz pianist invited him to an informal jam session in the basement lounge. We need someone who plays from the gut, not just the brain, he said. Even the professors treated him differently, not as a charity case, but as a peer. The harmony teacher used his audition piece as an example in class. Notice how emotion drives the structure here, not the other way around. The students listened, wide-eyed, as if they were studying a master, but Elias never acted like one. He still arrived early to wipe down the practice room pianos before class. Still picked up stray sheet music from the floor, still made sure the trash bins were emptied, even if it wasn't his shift one afternoon. As he was cleaning the hallway outside the theory classroom, a group of first-years approached him nervously. Sir, one began, we're working on our final project, a group composition. We were wondering if you'd let us quote a few bars from your piece. With credit, of course. Elias looked at them, earnest, respectful, a little awed. Of course, he said. But don't call me sir, my name's Elias, they grinned. Thanks, Elias. As they walked away, chattering excitedly, he leaned on his mop and watched them go. He thought about how, just weeks ago, they might have walked right through him without seeing him at all. Now, they saw him, not as a janitor who played piano, but as a musician who happened to clean floors. The real test came during his first composition seminar. The assignment was simple. Present an original 5-minute piece and explain your creative process. Most students brought printed scores, annotated with dynamics, tempo markings, and harmonic analysis. Elias brought nothing but himself. When it was his turn, he walked to the piano in the seminar room. No sheet music, no notes, just him and the keys. "I didn't write this down," he said. "I carry it here." He tapped his temple, then his chest. He played a new piece, shorter, simpler, but just as honest. It was called Morning Light on Marble Floors. It began with a single repeating note like a drop of water falling from a mop. Then a gentle melody rose, warm and steady, like sunlight creeping across a hallway at dawn. It wasn't flashy, but it was full of peace, of routine, of quiet dignity. When he finished, the room was silent. Then the professor, a stern woman known for her brutal critiques, stood up. "That," she said, voice thick, "is what we've been missing." After class, students gathered around him, not for autographs but for conversation. "How do you do that?" one asked. "How do you make it feel so human?" Elias thought for a moment. "I don't try to impress," he said. "I just try to tell the truth, even if it's messy." That became his unofficial motto. As the weeks passed, Something beautiful began to grow at the conservatory. The divide between staff and students softened. Custodians were greeted by name. Practice rooms stayed cleaner, not because of rules, but because students started picking up after themselves. Music became less about perfection and more about connection. And Elias, he kept playing, not for fame, not for validation, but because now he finally had permission to let his music live in the light. One evening, as he sat alone in room 101, practicing a new section of a longer work he was composing, Dubois appeared in the doorway. "You're writing another one," he said, not as a question. Elias nodded. "It's called The Janitor's Nocturne." Dubois smiled. "I can't wait to hear it." He didn't stay long. Just long enough to listen to a few phrases, then nod and walk away. But in that moment, Elias knew. He wasn't just tolerated here, he belonged, and that was worth more than any scholarship. The weeks turned into months, and the conservatory settled into a new rhythm, one where Elias wasn't just a curiosity, but a quiet presence woven into the fabric of daily life. He attended morning classes in music theory, took notes with the same careful attention he once gave to scrubbing baseboards, and spent afternoons in room 101, composing at the piano with the door slightly ajar so students could wander in if they wanted to listen. No one ever interrupted. They'd just sit on the floor near the door, notebooks in laps, eyes closed, letting his music wash over them like a calm tide. He still wore his custodial uniform 2 days a week, arriving early to finish his rounds before class. At first, some students had been awkward around him, unsure whether to call him Mr. Carter or just Elias, whether to treat him as staff or peer. But he made it easy. He'd nod, say good morning, ask how their pieces were coming along. He never made a show of his dual role. To him, cleaning and composing weren't opposites. They were both acts of care. One kept the space clean. The other kept the soul clean. News of his story had spread far beyond the city. A documentary crew reached out, then a national magazine. Offers came in, recording contracts, guest performances, interviews on morning shows. Most people in his position would have jumped at the chance, but Elias politely declined nearly all of them. "I'm not ready," he'd say. Or more honestly, "I don't want to turn this into a spectacle." He wasn't chasing fame. He'd spent decades playing in silence. Now that he had a room that listened, he didn't want to leave it for stages that only wanted a story, not the song. But there was one invitation he couldn't refuse. The conservatory's annual winter gala, a formal evening where donors, alumni, and dignitaries gathered to celebrate the school's achievements, was coming up. Traditionally, it featured star students and guest artists. This year, Dubois announced something new: the debut performance of the Viridian Scholarship recipient. And that was Elias. The announcement sent a quiet ripple through the building. Some faculty members raised eyebrows. A few donors called to express concern. Was it appropriate to feature a janitor at such an event? But Dubois held firm. Greatness doesn't announce itself with a resume, he told them. Sometimes it knocks on the door with a mop in hand. Elias agreed to perform, but only on one condition. He'd play his new piece, The Janitor's Nocturne, and he'd wear his uniform. Dubois didn't argue. He simply nodded. "Then we'll make sure the spotlight finds you." Preparation began in earnest. Elias spent every spare moment refining the piece. It was his most personal work yet, a meditation on invisibility, dignity, and the quiet beauty of ordinary labor. The opening was sparse, just a few low notes like footsteps echoing in an empty hallway at dawn. Then a gentle melody emerged, warm and steady like the rhythm of polishing wood or folding linens. Midway the music swelled, not with drama but with gratitude, as if thanking the silence that had held him all those years. The ending returned to simplicity, a single repeating phrase that faded like breath on a cold window. He practiced until his fingers ached, not for perfection, but for truth. He wanted the audience to feel what it was like to love something deeply while standing in the shadows. The night of the gala arrived cold and clear. Snow dusted the streets and the conservatory glowed like a lantern against the winter dark. Black cars lined the curb. Women in elegant gowns, men in tuxedos, and wealthy patrons with fur collars and diamond pins streamed through the grand entrance. Inside, the lobby shimmered with crystal chandeliers, silver trays of champagne, and the soft hum of polite conversation. Backstage, in a small dressing room usually reserved for guest soloists, Elias sat alone. He wasn't wearing a tuxedo. He wore his cleanest custodial uniform, dark blue shirt, pressed trousers, polished boots. Over it, he'd added a simple black vest, a gift from a student who'd said, "You deserve to look like you belong here because you do." He didn't look in the mirror. He didn't need to. He knew who he was. A stagehand knocked softly. 5 minutes, Elias nodded. He took a deep breath, closed his eyes, and ran his fingers over the keys of the practice piano in the corner. Not playing, just feeling their shape, their promise. Out in the hall, the audience settled into their velvet seats. Among them sat Dubois, front row center, back straight, expression unreadable. Behind him, rows of students, many in formal wear but some in jeans and sweaters, having snuck in through a side door because they refused to miss this. Even the custodial staff had been given seats in the back, a rare honor. They sat quietly, hands folded, eyes bright with pride. Then the lights dimmed. A hush fell over the room. The stagehand announced, "Ladies and gentlemen, Elias Carter." Silence. Then slowly, Elias walked onto the stage. No grand entrance, no bow, just a man in a work uniform, walking with quiet purpose toward the grand piano at the center of the stage. The spotlight followed him, casting a soft circle of light around the instrument. A few gasps. A few murmurs. But mostly stillness. He sat, adjusted the bench, placed his hands in his lap for a moment as if gathering himself, and then he began. The first notes of the janitor's nocturne hymn floated into the air, so soft they seemed to hang like snowflakes. The audience leaned forward, straining to hear. There was no flourish, no fanfare, just a single honest line of melody, played with the kind of tenderness usually reserved for lullabies or last words. In the third row, a wealthy donor who'd come only to network glanced at his watch, then froze. Something in that simple phrase reached him, though he couldn't say why. He put the watch away. In the back, one of the older custodians wiped his eyes with the back of his hand. He'd worked alongside Elias for 10 years. Never knew he could do this. Never knew the man mopping floors beside him carried an entire world inside. Dubois sat perfectly still. His usual composure was gone. His eyes were fixed on Elias's hands, watching how they moved, not with trained precision but with lived-in grace. Every note felt earned. Every pause felt necessary. As the piece unfolded, the room seemed to shrink. The chandeliers, the gowns, the status, all of it faded. There was only the music and the man playing it and the truth it carried. When the music swelled in the middle section, warm, full, almost joyful, students began to cry. Not from sadness, but from recognition. They'd spent years chasing technical perfection, trying to impress judges and teachers. But this reminded them why they'd fallen in love with music in the first place. Not for applause, not for awards, but for the way it could hold your heart when no one else would. Elias played with his eyes closed, lost in the current of his own creation. His fingers, calloused from years of work, pressed into the keys with a certainty that came not from training but from living. He wasn't performing. He was sharing, and the audience understood. When the final notes came, soft, repeating, fading like footsteps walking away, The silence that followed was deeper than any applause. No one moved. No one breathed. For a full 15 seconds, the only sound was the distant hum of the building's old furnace. Then, from the back of the hall, one person stood. It was the head custodian, a man in his 60s, uniform slightly wrinkled, cap in hand. He clapped once, then again, slowly, deliberately, one by one. Others rose, students, faculty, even the skeptical donors. Soon, the entire hall was on its feet, clapping not out of politeness, but out of reverence. Elias opened his eyes. He looked out at the sea of faces, some tear-streaked, some awed, all changed, and gave a small, humble nod. Then he stood, walked to the edge of the stage, and bowed. Not deeply, not dramatically, just enough to say, "Thank you for listening." As he stepped off the stage, Dubois was waiting in the wings. For a long moment, they just looked at each other. No words were needed. Then Dubois placed a hand on Elias's shoulder, something he'd never done before, and said, voice thick, "You didn't just play a piece tonight. You gave us back our soul." Elias smiled faintly. "I just played what I know." "That's the rarest thing of all," Dubois said. Later that night, long after the gala ended, Elias walked home through the quiet, snow-covered streets. He didn't take a car. He wanted to feel the cold air on his face, the crunch of snow under his boots. He passed closed shops, darkened apartments, sleeping city blocks. No one recognized him. No one stopped him, and that was fine, because he wasn't playing for them. He'd played for the boy in the laundromat apartment, for the man who mopped floors while dreaming in C minor, for everyone who's ever been told they don't belong, but kept showing up anyway. And as he turned the key to his apartment, he knew one thing for certain. He hadn't just silenced a room with his music, he'd given voice to the quiet ones, and that was enough. Spring came slowly to the city, melting the last of the snow and coaxing green shoots from the earth around the conservatory grounds. Inside the building, a different kind of thaw had taken place, one not measured in degrees but in glances, gestures, and the quiet hum of changed hearts. Elias still walked the same halls, still carried his mop bucket on his part-time days, but now students greeted him by name, not out of obligation, but because they genuinely wanted to. Some even asked for advice on their compositions, not because he had a degree, but because they trusted the honesty in his ear. His life had settled into a rhythm that felt both ordinary and miraculous. Mornings were spent in class, learning to read scores he'd once only felt, wrestling with music theory terms that sounded like another language, but slowly making them his own. Afternoons belonged to the piano, where he worked on a new project, a full-length suite inspired by the rhythms of daily labor, sweeping, polishing, folding, waiting. He called it Hands That Hold the Silence. It wasn't meant for fame. It was meant as a thank you note to all the unseen people who keep the world running while no one's watching. But the world hadn't forgotten him. Videos of his gala performance had gone viral, again. This time it wasn't just local news. National outlets picked it up. A late-night talk show invited him on. A major record label offered a contract with full creative control. This time Elias didn't say no right away. He thought about it. Talked it over with Dubois, who, to his credit, didn't push either way. "Do what feeds your music," he'd said, "not what feeds your ego." In the end, Elias agreed, but only to record one album, and only if it included spoken word interludes, short reflections on work, dignity, and the quiet courage of ordinary life. The label hesitated, then agreed. They'd never heard anything like it. Neither had anyone else. The recording sessions took place in a small studio downtown, not some glossy Hollywood setup. Elias insisted on using his old upright piano from his apartment for certain tracks, the one with the sticky pedal and the chipped key. "That's where the music was born," he told the engineer. "It should be part of the story." The team nodded, moved more than they expected to be. While he worked on the album, something unexpected began happening at the conservatory. Applications for the next year's open scholarship tripled, not just from prodigies or private school graduates, but from bus drivers, nurses, factory workers, people who'd seen Elias's story and thought, maybe my voice matters too. The admissions office was overwhelmed. Dubois, for the first time in his career, advocated for expanding the program, creating a new track for non-traditional artists. The board resisted at first, but the public response and the surge in donations convinced them. Elias never asked for any of this. He didn't campaign. He didn't give speeches. He just kept showing up, doing the work, playing the truth. Then came the final recital of the semester, the one promised in his scholarship agreement. It wasn't just another performance. It was his official debut as a student composer. The program listed his name alongside graduate candidates and guest artists. Tickets sold out in hours. This time he didn't wear his uniform. Not because he was ashamed of it, but because he wanted the music to stand on its own. He wore a simple black suit, bought secondhand, tailored by a seamstress who'd seen his gala video and refused to take payment. "Consider it my investment," she'd said with a wink. The night of the recital, the hall was packed, not just with students and faculty, but with people from the neighborhood, former co-workers, even strangers who'd driven hours just to hear him play. Among them sat his grandmother's old neighbor, the one who'd given them the piano all those years ago. She'd read about him in the paper and cried for an hour. Now she sat in the third row, hands folded, eyes shining. Dubois sat in his usual spot front and center, but this time he wasn't taking notes. He wasn't judging. He was just listening like everyone else. Elias walked on stage to warm, sustained applause. No gasps this time, no whispers of disbelief. Just respect. He bowed slightly, sat, and placed his hands on the keys. He began with a short prelude, just 2 minutes, called First Light. It was the sound of hope waking up. Then came a piece for piano and cello, written with a fellow student who'd once been too nervous to speak to him. They played it together, their instruments weaving around each other like old friends catching up. But the centerpiece was the Janitor's Nocturne, now expanded, refined, but still raw at its core. As he played, something shifted in the room. It wasn't just a performance anymore. It was a shared memory. People closed their eyes and saw mops leaning in corners, steam rising from coffee cups at dawn, hands working while hearts dreamed. The music didn't just fill the hall, it filled the spaces between people. When the final note faded, the silence returned, but softer this time, like a held breath released in peace. Then the applause came. Not thunderous, but deep, sustained, grateful. Afterward, during the reception in the lobby, people lined up to speak to him. Not for autographs, but for connection. A young man in a maintenance uniform shook his hand and said, "I fix boilers. But I write poems at night. You made me think. Maybe that matters too." An elderly woman touched his arm and whispered, "My husband was a night watchman. He played harmonica. I wish he'd lived to hear you." Elias listened to each one, looked them in the eye, said thank you, not as a star but as a fellow traveler. Later, as the crowd thinned, Dubois approached. He didn't say much, just handed Elias a small envelope. Inside was a letter of recommendation for a teaching position at the conservatory, not as a janitor, not as a student, but as an artist in residence with a focus on authentic expression and community music. "You've already been teaching," Dubois said quietly. "You just didn't know it." Elias looked at the letter, then at the man who'd once barely glanced up when he walked into an audition. "I don't have a degree," he said. "You have something better," Dubois replied. "You have truth. And that's what we've been missing." They stood in silence for a moment, two men from different worlds now standing on the same ground. Over the next year, Elias's life continued to unfold in quiet, meaningful ways. His album was released to critical acclaim, not because it was flashy, but because it felt real. Critics called it a masterpiece of humility. Listeners called it the soundtrack to my hidden life. He toured modestly, small venues, community centers, even a few high schools, always insisting on free or low-cost tickets so no one would be turned away. But he never left the conservatory. He taught one class a week, Music as Memory, where students were encouraged to compose from personal experience, not theory alone. He kept his part-time custodial shift, not out of necessity, but as a reminder. On his cleaning days, students would sometimes join him, not to help, but to talk. About fear, about failure, about the courage it takes to create when no one's watching. And every evening he still went home to his small apartment, sat at his old upright piano, and played, not for an audience, but for himself. because that's where it all began. In the quiet, in the dark, in the love of something that asked for nothing but your honesty. Years later, long after his album had become a quiet classic, long after new students had come and gone, someone asked Dubois what changed that day in the audition hall. He paused, then said, "We thought we were listening for talent, but what we really heard was humanity. And you can't teach that. You can only recognize it when it walks in, mop in hand, and dares to sit down." Elias never became a household name. He didn't win Grammys or headline festivals. But in the hearts of those who heard him, really heard him, he left a mark deeper than fame. Because he reminded them that greatness isn't always loud. Sometimes it's the quiet person in the back of the room who's been paying attention all along. And when they finally speak, the world doesn't just listen, it changes.